Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're going to give it just a minute to give people a chance to sign on, and then we'll get started. Thanks again to everybody for joining us. We'll give it about one more minute, and then we'll get started. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of our Homeroom with Education Leaders webinar. Today's conversation is focused on the dishonesty gap, exploring the use of NAEP data in a post-COVID era. My name is Lucy Barrier-Matheson, and I am a senior policy analyst on the K-12 team here at the Hunt Institute. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute and our work, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt and serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the education spectrum through in-person and virtual convenings, research, and other forms of technical assistance. Before getting the conversation started, I wanted to provide a brief logistical overview. We'll start the discussion with about a 30 to 40 minute moderated discussion with our panelists, and then we will pivot to a Q&A with the audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address them during the conversation. Additionally, we will record this webinar, and in the next couple of days, it will be posted to our YouTube channel. We also encourage you to join us on Twitter over the next hour, where you can participate in today's conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom that you can also see on the slide here. And speaking of today's conversation, we are so appreciative to the panelists who are joining us today. The recent release of the 2022 NAEP data reignited ongoing conversations around the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how learning loss differs across states and districts. While these conversations are crucial, we're taking a little bit of a different approach today to consider what NAEP data is truly telling us, how this compares to the information we learned from state assessments, and how, as education leaders, we can ensure that we're communicating findings from both of these metrics in a way that is accurate, clear, and actionable. According to Achieve, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit education organization focused on raising academic standards, improving assessments, and strengthening accountability, the quote honesty gap, unquote, is the disparity between the stories told by state assessment results and those told by NAEP. The honesty we're referring to in today's conversation is not the honesty or dishonesty of people. It is the honesty and accuracy of how the results from these two measures are being used to draw conclusions and communicate whether students are prepared for future success. Where is there alignment between state assessments and NAEP, and where do they differ? How do we ensure that when we talk about them, we're making those distinctions so that we're appropriately acting on the results to strengthen education for all kids? To help us explore these questions, I am very pleased to introduce Jillian Balow, Virginia Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Curtis Kane, Superintendent of Rockwood School District in Eureka, Missouri, and the 2022 National Superintendent of the Year, Kevin Dykema, President of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and our moderator, Dr. Melody Schopp, who is the Director of Education Industry Consulting at SAS. Thank you all so much for joining us. And Melody, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and a special thanks to the Hunt Institute. They continue this ongoing work, bringing together opportunities like this for these really great conversations across the country. And they're always, topics that are at the top of everybody's mind, and this is definitely one of them. I've been in education a long, long time, and never before do I remember that the NAEP results made such huge headlines. And none of us can ignore the fact the pandemic impacted student learning. And this data was truly a critical wake-up call, and it was a very important data point. But now every state is thinking about how do we support students' academic recovery? That's the word we're hearing, is recovering at this point. And to do so, I believe we really need to think about that systems approach. And one of those pieces is to provide educators with what we would think of as actionable data that they can use and put in the hands of educators. And that's the work that we've done at SAS. We've helped 13 states to this point to measure the impacts of the pandemic on student learning in a little bit different sort of way. Dr. Kane, I know in Missouri, you've been part of this study, and I'm really anxious to hear your thoughts later. Superintendent Balo, we're starting to engage with you in Virginia in a similar study. What makes it unique is that SAS uses a student's entire available testing history in all grades and in all subjects. And when we do that, students are compared to themselves to measure their learning loss, their growth, and their recovery. States have found this to this point to be very useful to measure the impact of the pandemic, because it reveals the strengths and the struggles, and it does it by district, by school, by grade, by subject, by student group, and even down to the individual student level. That's what we all want to know. We want to know, how did it impact my student? And that's the level of information that I think education leaders and teachers, that's what they need if they're going to make really good instructional decisions about how they approach learning recovery. So that actionable data is just one critical piece of that puzzle. And when it's wrapped around with supportive relationships and an evidence-based approach to student supports, that's when we can really have a systemic way to address the pandemic. And that's what I know all of you are doing here today. That's what you're doing in your states and districts. And so the panel we have today, this is what we're going to talk about. And Superintendent Bale, it's so great to see you again. And I know you've been out front in these conversations, and you were out front in that conversation even before the recent release of the 2022 NAEP data. And I remember you had expressed concerns about the honesty gap in Virginia and whether the state assessments were truly capturing and communicating how students are learning. Can you tell all of us a little bit more about how you hope to use the NAEP as a guide to strengthen state assessments of Virginia?
Yeah, well, first of all, Dr. Schaaf, it's really great to see you. Thank you for moderating today, and what a distinguished panel this is. Thank you also to the Hunt Institute for hosting important conversations like this that are really what I would describe as discussion starters, not discussions with a beginning and an end. So that's what I really hope my comments offer to all of you. And I guess I want to start with the classroom and say that as a teacher, way back when, before my policy years, NAEP was a test that we took seriously, but not a test that we as teachers gleaned a whole lot from. Enter my first year as state superintendent when the NAEP scores came out, and lo and behold, I got this letter that said, Wyoming, which is where I was the state superintendent, congratulations, you are a truth teller. And I remember just holding that piece of paper and thinking, I'm not sure what this means. My dad told me there are two types of people in the world, people who tell the truth and people who don't. So I'm glad I'm a truth teller, but I already knew that. And so as I delved into what it meant to be a truth teller that later became the honesty gap, it was the same thing. It was achieve, just really dug in after No Child Left Behind and after states adopted their state assessments, they started seeing some disparity between state assessment scores and what NAEP was saying, and really started calculating that in an analytical manner that was meaningful to states. We took that compliment at the time in Wyoming of being a truth teller as just that, a compliment. When I came to Virginia at the beginning of 2022, I started looking at that same data because it was impactful for me when I learned we were a truth teller or we didn't have an honesty gap. And I saw Virginia was one of the few states that hadn't addressed the honesty gap. And I wanted to understand more of that because across the nation, NAEP is used as really a determinant for a lot of state level policies. We've seen at the national level how states like Mississippi have received high marks in reading and early reading and have started a whole movement across the nation around the science of reading and literacy based in the science of reading. And that's not because of NAEP, but it's certainly propelled by NAEP when we look at our scores. And so it's important for me as a state superintendent and as a state leader and as a national leader to really dig in, not just to the honesty gap, but to really look at what the NAEP scores mean and what they don't mean. And both of those are really, really important. There's no assessment that tells the whole story about a student, a state, or a nation, but NAEP is a really important measure because it's been a gold standard for years and years and years. And so how do we use the NAEP data? How do we use metrics like the honesty gap to really help drive improvement, to help tell the story about where we are as a state or where we are as a nation and move from there? Thanks, Dr. Schott.
You bet. It's so great to see you. I just want to let you know that in your former state, you're probably in the same place. I'm sitting here with a lot of snow outside today, and I don't think that's happening in Virginia today. So it's great to see you again. You know, you just brought up a really good point that I jotted down about how we need sometimes those wake up calls to drive change, you know, like what happened in Mississippi. And so, you know, it's one data point that we're using across the country to do that. And I think that's important. But I'd like to move on to you, Kevin, you know, in NCTM statement in response to the release of that 2022 NAEP scores, you state that it's even more critical is the systemic structures in place that use education, specifically mathematics education, to restrict and deny opportunities to students of color and those who are economically disadvantaged. So what I think I'm interested in, and everybody is what are those systemic structures in place around math education, and how do various measures of student achievement we're discussing today play a role?
Thank you, Dr. Schott, for moderating this panel. Thank you to the Hunt Institute for holding this very important conversation. And I love how Superintendent Baylor said this is a conversation starter, not a conversation ender. And I look forward to the conversations that are going to happen in your areas as you process the thoughts that the three of us are starting to generate today. When I think of, you know, how has math education been distorted? How has education been distorted? Systematically, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One of them, we misuse assessment data often. And we misuse that assessment data and we start sorting our students and preventing opportunities for some of our students, particularly those who are Black, Brown, and have low socioeconomic status. And we often prevent them from having high quality mathematics instruction. So often when we do this sorting by perceived ability, and we may say it's based on the test results, but a lot of times it comes down to sort of what is that teacher perception. When we sort and when we do some tracking and by ability groups, too often those that are in the lower tracks, their instruction looks dramatically different than those who are perceived as doing well. Those who are perceived as struggling based on assessment scores, based on other things, often get what I like to call drill and kill. It becomes mathematics by worksheet. We give them a worksheet. We give them another worksheet. We give them another worksheet. We often talk slower to the students or louder to the students and just keep repeating the same thing. Contrast that to those students who we perceive as doing great, whether it's teacher perception, whether it's community perception, whether it's based on assessment data, whatever the case may be, those who are perceived as doing well, we give them the rich, deep math problem solving. We have them think about the mathematics. It shouldn't be just for our students who we perceive as doing well. Each and every one of our students must be engaged daily in thinking about that deep mathematics. So I would argue that oftentimes our test scores are sorting our students when they shouldn't be sorting our students. Those test scores really should be looking at systematically, district-wide, building-wide, Where are there some gaps and opportunities? Where are there some things that, hey, it may be written that this is a focus area, but our students aren't performing well on there. So let's look at that. Not looking at that individual student and saying, oh, you know what? You didn't do so hot that day. Let's sort you into a lower group. There could be a ton of factors of why a student didn't perform as well on a given day. You know, a student who's just battling a flu, for instance, or just coming back from COVID. And when they take that high stakes assessment, they may not score as well. Too often we focus on that rote memorization. We overreact to assessment results. We look at the NAEP result and we say, oh my goodness, we're in a world of hurt. Let's focus on that rote memorization to get them caught up. No, I think we need to take the opposite approach. We need to look and say, hey, you know what? Before the pandemic hit, we were showing some gains and we were having our students talk about mathematics with each other. We were having them engage deeply. And during the pandemic, instruction changed. Because of the virtual nature of many places, many teachers switched from those rich conversations to here's step one, here's step two, here's step three. Mathematics became mathematics by memorization. And we can see from the NAEP results, from other results, that didn't work so well for our students. It's important then that we see our students as capable of learning mathematics. And then we help our students believe that they are capable of learning mathematics. And when we just tell them memorize a set of steps for what seems to them to be a random set of problems, that's not honoring them. That's not helping them recognize that they are capable of learning mathematics. So we need to continue to break away from sorting our students, and we need to really focus on getting math by understanding and helping our students develop that positive identity and helping them realize that they are capable of learning mathematics.
Thank you, Kevin. You know, I jotted down two things that really hit me about. We often misuse assessment data, which I think is tempting for all of us because we want to fix things. That's our nature as educators, but also how critically important it is to look systemically. And that's where I think I want to move to with you, Dr. Kane. You know, I know as a superintendent, you've been working in the trenches. I bet you could give us a lot of stories to relate to regarding the past few years. I also know that Missouri, you've made efforts to analyze your student achievement data in these new and innovative ways to measure the impact of the pandemic. The Department of Education in Missouri, they partner with us at SAS to compare 2020-21 data to 2018-19 student assessment results. And this analysis, like so many others, found that the younger students, the Black, the Hispanic students, low-income students, students with disabilities, all experienced disproportionate harm. NAEP has also provided additional data around student learning for consideration. So as a leader, how do you use these various state metrics, and do you value some measures over others? And if so, can you tell us why?
Well, Dr. Shoup, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to participate on this very important call, and also want to thank the Hunt Institute as well. To be very frank, I struggle with the topic in the sense of the definition of dishonesty. In the sense of with all the charge that there is in the world right now, I just think that we need to be very mindful with the verbiage that's being used. I think that, to be frank, not all assessment results make the cover of or the front page of a newspaper. And they're definitely, I'd say, competing in some cases, levels of gravitational force when it comes to the public distribution of certain results compared to others. It's very interesting listening to what Kevin was saying. And in many ways, the pandemic is exacerbating what already existed. When you look at the disproportionate performance as we see in terms of students, regardless of subgroup definition, many of these were conditions that existed prior to the pandemic. But I do think that we have to lean into the discomfort of where we stand at this point in time and figure out actionable pathways forward that not only add value, but allow us to also show the growth that is occurring for students. Quite honestly, not just on a monthly basis, but on a weekly and in many ways on a daily basis as well. That conversation about self-perception is so very true, especially in the area of mathematics. And there are historical components to this that add more weight to that statement. What we're doing is looking at a multitude of assessments, summative, interim assessments, looking at formative assessments as well. And it's about the totality of that assessment window assessment, the window of assessment itself. And what is it telling us? Not only by building and by grade, and not just by classroom, but ultimately by student as well. I have great confidence that we're going to work our way out of this. I do believe that it's going to take some time. And to be very frank, nationally, I don't think we can afford to get this wrong. As this nation continues to diversify and become much more diverse ethnically and culturally, we can't be in a situation where we're leaving certain students behind. And we have to aggressively attack what I would call, in many ways, historic predictability in terms of how students are ultimately going to perform or underperform. We have to, in order to maintain our status as the lead of all nations on this particular planet, this has to become a part of a national priority and a conversation of figuring out how we wrap around where we are. We can boo, hiss, and cry about where we are. What are we actionably doing to help move this forward for the good of every single student that's in our respective classrooms?
Dr. Kane, I think, that really hits home in that we can't say that this probably is new information that came out for us. It's been here. If nothing else, it probably gave us the impetus to move forward. And I think more than ever, you stated about how critically important it is that we don't let this moment go. That's for lots of reasons. We owe that to the students, but we also know that there's been this inordinate amount of money that's been poured into the education systems that we have a responsibility for, to make sure that when it's done, we can look back and say that we hope something happened as a result of that.
Absolutely. We have a fiscal obligation, but a moral responsibility. And the difference between crisis and opportunity is often just the lens that you're looking through, right? I say this is an opportunity, and there's urgency with this, right? Because in most cases, we get 13 years to get this as right as we possibly can on a daily basis, but we owe it to not only the students in terms of their present reality, but also their future opportunities as well.
You said a lot better than I did, Dr. King. While student achievement data, it's really critical for education leaders and policymakers. That's how we evaluate education systems. We can make adjustments accordingly, as we talked about. But it's also this key piece of how parents and families understand how their child is learning, what additional supports are needed. Understanding data from all these different assessments, parents read the headlines and so forth, and knowing how and if to take action in response is truly difficult, even for those of us in education. And we look at this every single day. I found it fascinating. Learning Heroes found in their 2021 parent survey that 92% of respondents believed that their child was performing at or above grade level, well above the number, of course, reflected in our assessment data. So I'd like each of you to respond to this. How can we ensure that student level achievement data is accessible to parents and families in a way that really empowers them to be active and engaged decision makers for their child's education? Superintendent Baylor, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Shop. I just think that's such an important conversation. And as all of us have stated today, NAEP was in the headlines this year more than years past, although 2019 was a pretty big year as well, because we had all but 3 states either stay the same or show, actually all but 3 states, I believe, showed a decline in 4th grade reading, which really preempted a pretty large science of reading movement across the nation led by Mississippi. But let's talk about parents, because parents see those headlines and maybe it does or maybe it doesn't square with what their child's report card says or what they're hearing from teachers. But alongside that data that you just quoted from 2021 is another statistic that says most teachers, almost all teachers, know where their kids are, and it's nowhere near 91% or 97% of parents. So the teachers know what's happening. But there are a few things that happen, right? Teachers aren't sure how to have those difficult conversations with parents. They don't have the information, the data that they need to have those conversations with parents. They don't maybe have the expertise to have those conversations. And the third thing is that sometimes teachers don't feel supported by their administrators to have those tough conversations. So I think as educators and leaders, we really need to find ways to better support teachers to have difficult conversations with parents about how their kids are really doing. The second thing that we really need to do is make sure that when teachers, if we're going to focus or if we're going to have headlines that say, NAEP scores are this. And if we're going to have periods in our child's lives where parents take a role in education like they did in 2020 and 2021, we need to make sure that they're equipped with the data literacy and the same kind of prowess that we would expect our teachers to have those conversations or to accept those conversations. So I'm one who believes certainly in the First Amendment, our right to free speech, our right to go to school board meetings and talk about the things that displease us, etc. But there are so many other entry points into the conversation, and we have largely become accustomed as parents, and I'm speaking first person here, and as teachers and educators in having transactional relationships that we pretend are meaningful. And we've got to get past that and really get to a place where we're proactive with our relationships with parents, and parents are proactive with relationships with teachers, and they're meaningful. And we have set the stage for some of these difficult conversations. So it's really what Dr. Kane talked about. And you know what, we want to know where our students are and what to do to get them to where they need to be. And if we're able to set the table and know how to have those communications, I think that makes things much better. And when we talk about those, sometimes those conversations are hard. And as Dr. Kane said, we don't like some of the terminology that we have to use. So how do we have conversations that are meaningful, but also really honest? And we have to have good data from the NAEP down to the classroom level and the day-to-day instruction, teaching and learning that takes place to really be able to have those conversations.
Whole conversation and moving from transactional to proactive. I think that's a powerful statement there. Dr. Kane, can you weigh in on the same topic, please?
I can, not only as superintendent, but also the father of a student in the district. I'm brand new to the district, so that had to be a unique and very happy opportunity for a teacher to realize that you're going to have the superintendent's child. Look, I believe in positive conspiracies, and that we are wrapping around the relationship, right? That I call it the sacred trust that parents put in the hands of educators. But we have to find meaningful ways to communicate, even when it's the stuff that we don't want to hear. And now that we have school doors that are open again, how do we actually provide the opportunity for, quite honestly, a degree of professional development and training, right? This is what interim assessment means, and providing some definitions that don't shock and scare and throw off people, or even open the door to more questions in terms of what it actually means. And so whether it's a parent university opportunity, whether it's an extension activity through a PTA, PTO, whether it's a curriculum night, we have doors open. Let's open the doors and figure out how to get folks in so that they can understand what's happening within their classrooms. I can tell you, we had to work through the wrinkle of, if you're using a manipulative-based constructivist model in terms of your mathematics instruction, how do you handle manipulatives in a time of a pandemic? Right, we're working our way out of that. And if we aren't careful, it quickly becomes we don't, and we stay in the land of the worksheet. All things in moderation. How do we put all of these different modalities together to most effectively improve what is happening in terms of student understanding when it comes to mathematics? And so we can use social media, we can use webinars. We actually have snippets of video that parents are able to review, so they understand when you see these STAR assessment results, this is what this actually means. How your student is comparing to other students in terms of just cohort analysis, specifically how they're performing. It's those pieces, but we have to do this in terms of engaging in this conversation with dignity. Every parent deserves the right to walk away from a conversation with the same level of dignity that they had when they walked into the conversation. And if we want people to help, we have to meet them there. We have to meet them in a dignified manner, respecting their role as parent, the first educator for that student, and figure out how we can have the ability to actually build the toolbox in terms of instructional pedagogy, in terms of understanding that parents have in terms of what's going on in classrooms.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. And I know that particularly in the area of math, Kevin, I bet you have some thoughts as well. And then when you're done, I want to follow up with a question for you as well. But could you respond to the same question?
Absolutely. So before assuming my role as president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, I was a classroom teacher and taught middle school math. And as such, I shared the student data with parents on a regular basis at parent-teacher conferences. And I really want to build off of Dr. Balo. She talked about having our parents become data literate. I think that is so vital. And when I'm sharing the data with parents, I'm trying to educate them. What is the data really showing? Are we comparing students to students with a percentile? Are we comparing, for this data here, is it comparing the student performance based on a set of standards? Parents see a number like 63 and they assume it may be one or it may be the other. And we've got to help them, we have to help them understand, what are we really looking at there? We also need to help them realize, and Dr. King mentioned this in his first response, it's one piece of data when we look at one thing. We need to be looking at multiple pieces of data to get that true picture. And I think I shared earlier, we don't know what happened that morning before school started. As a middle school teacher, I know there are a lot of things that can throw a middle school student off for that day. Something that we may think is a relatively minor thing may be a huge issue in their mind, and they're so focused on whatever else that they don't take the test as seriously as they may have 2 days from now. So it's working with parents, helping them understand it's one piece of data, helping our parents recognize, what is the data really telling us? Is it student to student? Is it student to a set of standards? I also think of the New Teacher Project, TNTP, and they have the opportunity myth. And they talk in that opportunity myth that we don't have an education system in the United States. We really have thousands of different education systems in the United States. What's taught in 3rd grade in Southeast Michigan may look different than what's taught in 3rd grade in Southern California, may look different than 3rd grade in rural part of South Dakota. We don't have this single education system, but yet so many of our assessments are nationwide assessments. And we're comparing not apples to apples, we're comparing apples to oranges at that point in time. And I also think we need to be conscious of how much time are we spending giving assessments, and what is the value of giving that? In some spots, I've read some data that up to 40% of time sometimes is spent doing assessments. That's saying that instruction's not happening. And yeah, we can say formative assessment is really instructional, and it may be, but think about the amount of time that our students are spending assessing, and we're trying to figure out where they're at rather than teaching new content. And we often wonder then why they're behind some arbitrary set of standards. Maybe we spend a little bit more time doing instruction and less time over assessing our students at times. We may actually be able to make some better gains. So I think a lot of it's just working with our parents and helping our parents understand, what is that data saying and what is the purpose of assessments.
So Kevin, I'm going to continue to pick on you as long as we've got you. We have a question from the audience. They would like you to provide some prime examples of how assessment data should be used. And you noted, at the beginning, that data shouldn't be used to separate students. So how can we embrace data in our decisions without trying to separate out students and still provide that really good content for them?
Yeah, I think, assessment data should be used for the big picture. A building should be looking at that assessment data, finding where the areas of perceived weakness are as a building, where the areas of perceived strength are as a building. And when we look at our assessment results, whether it's the state assessment results, whether it's the NAEP results, whether it's some other set of results, looking at, in those areas that we didn't score as well, why not? What's preventing our students from doing well on that data? Is it the way we delivered that content? Is it that just was content that we didn't get to for whatever reason? Is it a mismatch in alignment between the assessment and between what is our set of standards? So I think we use that assessment data, especially with those high stakes assessments, we need to use that for a little bit more global perspective, not for the day-to-day sorting students, making instructional decisions about a particular student. We're looking at and making decisions about the entire building, about the entire district, about the entire state. And then I think that's an appropriate use of assessment data.
Helpful, Kevin. So I'm going to come over to you, Superintendent Balo, first, and then Dr. Kane too. I'm just thinking back into the NCLB days. Remember, we had a whole new level of vocabulary that started out with calling kids proficient. And then we labeled them as basic and we gave them all these different titles as well. There's a question for the audience on determining whether proficient on state assessment equals the same thing as on grade level. And if not, how do parents and families and other stakeholders know what in the world on grade level really is? I'll start with you, Superintendent Baylor.
Yeah, what a great opportunity to just kind of put some framing and add on to Kevin's comments before. But when we talk about assessment data, it's hardly ever apples to apples, right? That's why we have psychometricians in this world who are a whole lot smarter than I am. I know that, to help us make apples and apples, or apples to apples out of apples and oranges. That said, you know, NAEP again is one of the gold standard assessments. It's been around since the 60s. It's been administered. And what we know with that is that you know, the basic level, the proficient level, and the advanced level mean three very different things, and none of them mean grade level proficiency, as we've kind of already dispelled. If we're going with proficient on NAEP, it means that students can access and demonstrate mastery of challenging content that helps them be more on track for readiness, not only in the next grade, but in life. So again, if we're using NAEP as a gold standard, which we don't necessarily align apples to apples, our state assessments with that, but we certainly look to that again as a gold standard, a barometer, a thermometer, if you will. And so what we know is that state assessments are all over the place. Some have the same ratings, basic, proficient, advanced. Some of them have on grade level, below grade level, above grade level. And so it really, really depends. But almost every school division that's what we call them in Virginia, school district or region or state, has people to help sort through and make meaning of what does a rating mean with respect to where that child is performing in the classroom and on their trajectory toward education. And I'm really happy that Virginia is working with SAS, because your company helps us with that a lot. Dr. Shop helps us to look at the whole picture of assessments throughout a child's school career and make some meaning about where they are on their trajectory. And then just again, adding to Kevin's comments, you know, there are all kinds of assessments, right? Teachers, good teachers, are assessing every minute of every day, and they're doing that with every single child and making adjustments to their teaching so that children are as successful as possible. Sometimes they're giving formative assessments in the classroom that drive instruction from day to day. Sometimes they're giving summative assessments that say, is my child learning, or is the child learning over this course of time what they should have learned? And then we have those great big assessments, right? The state and the national assessments that really are kind of that barometer or that temperature check on the system. And all of them are important, but all of them are important for really, really different reasons. We would not want those day-to-day instructional decisions or assessments that teachers make to drive policy at the state level, in the same way that we wouldn't want a statewide NAEP score to be driving what's happening with a particular student on a particular day. So that's just kind of a big picture framing of assessment and its role. And just again to underscore the what you asked originally, Dr. Shop, and that is that a score can mean really different things. And that's why it's important for everyone to have at least a little bit of data literacy to be able to sort through what that score means. And teachers are really paramount in not only understanding that, but also being able to communicate that with their among their colleagues and with parents and others.
Okay, I'd like you to weigh in, but before we do that, I could just, you know, as you're talking, Superintendent Baylor, I think how critically important it is, and you take our previous kind of sort of conversation about parents, you can understand why it's got to be so terribly confusing for them to understand what in the world are they really saying about my child. So all the more important. But Dr. King, can you add into that conversation?
I just think we need to tell parents, right? And again, providing that space so that there's dignity in them, breaking down. I like that term that the superintendent was using, like this assessment literacy, so that they have an idea of what it actually means. It's a little bit like a tool. There's a reason you have a wrench, a crowbar, a hammer, a screwdriver in the toolbox, because there are different components that are needed at different points in time, and they're providing access and utility in different ways. And I just think we have to share that with parents, but we have to do it in a way that is not threatening, so that people understand the full scale of what we're in fact describing here, because it is, as I'm listening to this conversation, it's very complex. It is very, very complex. And you can have a deluge of data to the point that people just become numb to it. And at that point, forget the amount of time. It's like, it's doing no good at that point. And so I think we need to be smart with what we're doing as relates to assessment. Let there be meaning and value behind us doing it, and not just because we've always done it. But if we're taking and carving out that precious variable of time in order to do so, there needs to be value behind that as well, and just sharing it with parents. And I think it's going to take a retelling, in some cases over and over again, of, so you saw this in the fall, here's what you're going to see in the winter. Remember, we mentioned that in the fall, here's where we're going to go in the spring. And in the spring, we'll talk about, as we're looking at these intervals, right, in terms of how this compared to where you were in the winter, and then what that looked like in the fall. There's a way to do so that adds value, and it adds a deeper and much more accurate understanding of what is happening for students. I believe that's what parents are looking for.
We had another specific question for you, Dr. Kane, and all of you might be able to jump into this, but when we think about that data literacy thing that we've all been talking about, there is that reality of the number of hours in a day, so how do you as a district leader find time to train your administrators on exactly that? Because I think that's a big piece of that, in light of that, because effectively then they're able to better improve data literacy for their parents and families. But how do you carve that out with all the other demands and pressures?
We have to be the lead leader. The classroom's the reason we have the school district. I'm sorry, lead learner. We have to be the lead learner. The classroom's the reason we have a school district. And for all of the other energies and investments that we make in so many different areas, extracurricular, co-curricular, it's got to be ultimately the top priority. Our North Star has to be what's happening in those classrooms. And so us being able to support our teachers in not only professional learning communities or whatever that learning space looks like for educators, but us being able to support them in the dialogue and the conversations that grades, departments, teams, teachers are ultimately having with parents is a part of what I call that positive conspiracy. So that students are not only hearing it in the hallways, they're hearing it in the classrooms when they get home as well. When there's that aw shucks moment of, wait a minute, they're actually having that conversation completely surrounding me. So they're having that conversation. I think it puts a student, ultimately a family and a district, in a very different place.
So, our conversation today served as a sort of a springboard from the NAEP assessment data. So somebody had a question I think would be great if we could all answer. I'm going to start with you, Kevin, but what do you see as the purpose then of NAEP compared to the purpose of state assessments? So, why is this an important piece of information for us?
Yeah, I think it's an important piece. It's certainly not the most important piece. And it's an important piece because it's important to look at it as a nation. How are we doing as a nation? And how is a state in the South comparing to a state in the Midwest, a state to the West? All of our state tests all look a little bit different, and there may be political reasons why a certain score is passing in one state and not in another state. And when we have that NAEP results, that provides a little bit of a bigger overall picture. And we've talked several times about this data literacy and understanding the purpose of that. We have to acknowledge that there is a purpose for that NAEP data, but we can't take that NAEP data and try to apply it into different spots. And I love Dr. Keene's idea of that toolbox. It's a tool, but there are many other tools that we can use for different purposes. So it's identifying what is the purpose of that NAEP results, that nationwide, taking a big snapshot and keeping it at that level and not trying to misuse the NAEP data to prove other points.
Dr. Kane, do you want to jump in, and then Superintendent Bailo?
I just think it's a really critical time to recognize where we are. And as much as we're talking about mathematics, I also am have concern in terms of where students are socially and emotionally from a climate and self-awareness perspective, and how the pandemic has impacted not just numeracy and literacy, but just where students are in terms of their sense of well-being as well. And I think we're going to have to continue to engage in efforts to help close whatever the unfinished learning happens to be. We're going to have to continue to find ways to do just that, because it's all for naught if we have students that can't demonstrate that they are well adjusted, have a very healthy and robust sense, but honest sense of who they are and what they're doing, where their deficits are, where their opportunities for improvement and strength happen to be. And so this is just a subset of, I think, of a larger question of, we've had to freeze everything. How do we go about accelerating the thaw of everything and getting things going back? Because we can't ignore what we just experienced. And I think there's some learning opportunities in terms of hybrid learning, virtual opportunities as it relates to learning to address some of the concerns that we're discussing right now. But that's not just about mathematics. I think it's in other content areas and domain areas as well for students and families.
There we go. Superintendent Bella.
All right, thanks. It's hard to be the closer because I'm not going to do justice to what my colleagues on the panel have just said. I love the talk about dignity. I love the talk about it's not the end all be all or even the most important. It's a measure. It is a tool. That said, we have lots of tools, and in 2020, 2021, we got another big tool, and that was parents coming face to face and feeling what it was like to be a teacher or to facilitate learning. And so we have this new day and this new opportunity to really include parents in the conversation, because they figured out that it was challenging and they figured out that it was really important work. And so I think there's this opportunity that we don't want to see slip by. And as complicated as data and information is, it is a really important time to let it tell the story about where our kids are, what they've been through, but more importantly, what we can do from here. And, this is exciting. We're seeing lots of folks across the nation come out with not only great research like Dr. Kane, Dr. Reardon, Dr. Oster about the learning loss and the impact of school closures on our students and the role that parents play. But we're also seeing a lot of really, really great best practices in school districts and schools and in states across the nation. Mississippi released a playbook for high dosage tutoring that's research-based. Dr. Kane and Dr. Reardon just released a tool stating the learning loss that's felt by students district by district across the nation. And they're following that up with not only what to do about that, but what does research say is the best thing to do about that? So we have to not only look at the importance of data to tell us where we are, but also to really start thinking about what are our next steps? What do we know that works and how do we employ those? We're incredibly lucky right now. We have almost or a little over 2 years to utilize federal funds like we've never seen before. We've seen the table set for our title funds to be able to continue the great things that we start with our ESSER funds and our ARPA funds. And so I'm kind of going all over the place because that's, I think, where this net, when we cast out this net right now over all of the things that we have going on, it feels very overwhelming, but we have time and we have the right people leading the work. 2 of whom or 3, well, I won't include myself in that, but the panelists who just have such clear eyes and a full heart around going forward and around making sure that we utilize data, we utilize money, and we leverage what we know is best practice for students.
I have a really good final question. I think that all of you can, as we hopefully look more positively towards the future, but somebody asked a question. I think it's really important, and I'll let whoever feels. And maybe Kevin will start with you. I'll do the teacher thing and assign it. But what advice would you offer education leaders and policymakers who want to make that positive difference for students' lives and to use more data more honestly? I'll let you start.
Yeah, and I would argue every teacher, every policymaker wants to improve students' lives. And it's not just some, I think we all come into it with a heart for developing students and for helping them grow as human beings. So I think about, how do we do that in the area of policies around assessments? It's clearly identifying what is the purpose of that given assessment and clearly communicating that with everybody so that everybody knows the purpose of that assessment, and not taking a piece of data and misusing it. When I'm thinking policy decision time, sometimes we take data and we just twerk it to do whatever we want it to show. If we want to show that schools are doing well, we change the cutoffs. If we want to show that schools are doing poorly, we change the cutoffs to reflect that. So it's really, using the data appropriately and communicating clearly what is the purpose of that given piece of data. And I think the more that we do that, the better off we're going to be in serving our students.
We'll circle around to you.
Was that to me?
Dr. Kane, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
That's a great response. No, something has to be the priority. And I still believe that's what happens in our classrooms. And it's transparency, it's involvement, it's engagement, it's collective yet individuality kind of balanced at the same time. It's acknowledging the fact that our teachers are making thousands of instructional decisions every single day that add value. And you can't easily replicate that, but we can be of support in that endeavor. A student tracking literally their growth over time. If there's anything that adds to that notion of self-perception, it's that although we're moving at different rates, everybody's moving, right, in an upward manner. But I think that we have to increase what we're doing in terms of transparency and providing those opportunities for people to engage. Because as I say, parents, it's not just going to be parents. The more I think about this is going to be other caregivers, older siblings, whomever it happens to be. Tutoring was mentioned earlier as well. I just think that the more we stack positive supports, opportunities, and interventions to meet the needs of students, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah.
And Bela, what are those things that we can do to move forward, who want to make a positive difference and use data more honestly?
Yeah, I can't add a whole lot more to what my colleagues on the panel have said, but I want to underscore the importance of teachers using data, because that's really where it starts. Once teachers, there's that aha moment. There just is for educators when they learn and figure out how closely the work that they do from moment to moment in the classroom is tied to data. And in my opinion, in my experience, that happens during our professional learning community time in our schools, our PLCs, sometimes they're called. And when we have school leaders who are keen on making data a part of every discussion with teachers, then guess what happens during that PLC time? It becomes a lot less about talking about the culture of the school or the culture of the staff, and a lot more about the data and how we're approaching instruction for each and every one of our kids who are in our classes and who are in our school. And so again, this is nothing novel, and I'm echoing everything that my colleagues have said so far, but just maybe adding to or underscoring that importance of professional learning community time being coveted for data talks, and every single staff meeting led by a data, not just literate, but a data fanatic as a principal who really understands the data, the importance of talking about data, and the importance of really facilitating data conversations in a school, because that's what translates to the decisions being the right decisions at the right time in the classroom.
Well, thanks so much. It was so great to spend some time with all of you. Really, we could go on and on, but so appreciate this opportunity with each one of you, as well as with those who tuned in. And I'm going to turn it over to Lucy again. Thank you to the Hunt Institute for this really great opportunity to engage in this important conversation. Lucy?
Thank you so much, Melody. And thank you to Kevin and Dr. Kane and Superintendent Belo for being with us for this conversation. I think the key takeaway for me, and I am a big data person, I I'm a policy professional at heart and love to always go back to the data, but just making sure that we're being really intentional in creating those systems and those structures in that time to make sure that everything we do is just really grounded in that clear information, that clear data that we are using to make decisions and to move forward on behalf of kids. So thank you all again for this conversation. And for those of you who joined us, we wanted to share a few additional opportunities that we have coming up from the K-12 team at the Hunt Institute. Our next homeroom webinar will be on December 1st. It is a growing epidemic addressing violence in American schools. And the link to register for that has been placed in the chat. We hope you'll join us for this topic that we are sorry that we have to talk about, but think that it is important, particularly from a policy standpoint. We also have some additional conversations planned for the new year on January 12th and February 9th. So I hope that you will also plan to join us for those. You can also follow us on Twitter at Hunt K12Ed to stay up to date on what we're doing. And thank you again for joining us, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if there's anything that we can do to support you in your work. Thanks so much, and hope everyone has a great rest of the day.